Well, hello, everybody. I hesitate to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening because I think all of those apply for today's session. This is a special session of the Reading Pilgrimage Together reading group, where we've been lucky enough to essentially link arms with another reading group that just finished it recently, especially because it's an academic group who has read the Pilgrimage series in the context of the larger body of a modernist work. So we have with us today three special guests, Dr. Naomi Milthorpe, Dr. Robbie Moore, and Fergus Edwards, who is a PhD candidate, and they're all from the Department of English at the University of Tasmania in Hobart. And I'll turn it over now to Fergus, who will open with a few remarks, and then Naomi and Robbie will provide some of their own comments, and then we'll open it up for everybody to have questions, answers, discussions, thoughts. This is such a thought-provoking book that we'll keep this to an hour, but I'm sure we could go on much longer if everybody agreed. So with that, let me turn it over to Fergus, and let's start the process.
Fantastic. Well, Brad, thank you very much for the invitation. What I'm actually going to do is to invite Naomi to introduce the Modernist Reading Group at UTAS, because it's her baby, and I'm one of those privileged enough to be able to join it. Before I do, though, for those who aren't familiar with Australian academic practice, something that we feel is important, and certainly for myself and Naomi, for Robbie, just want to acknowledge that we are speaking from Palawa country today here in Lutruwita. It is Aboriginal land that was never ceded, and I'd like to acknowledge and offer my respect to the Aboriginal peoples who were here long before we were, and trust that they will be able to proceed in a spirit of reconciliation long after we're gone. So with that said, Naomi, Robbie, myself are all here at the University of Tasmania in Australia. Naomi is responsible for the group by way of logistics. After she's introduced the group, myself, then Robbie, then Naomi will spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes at least in my case, in a very non-academic way, talking a little bit about pilgrimage and the experience of reading through the series. And then, as Brad says, we'll open up to Q&A and conversation. So Naomi, all over to you.
Thanks, Fergus. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having us to this session. It's a real privilege to be talking about this book. And we certainly enjoyed this privilege of talking about this book over the course of pretty much a full year. So the Modernist Reading Group began at the University of Tasmania in 2018. Our first novel that we read was Stevie Smith's novel On Yellow Paper. So we from the very first took a kind of idiosyncratic view of modernism, or an expansive view of what modernism was. Since then, we've read fiction, short and long, poetry, essays, and also criticism in, on, and around modernism and modernism adjacent topics. Now, I don't want to give the kind of wrong impression that the University of Tasmania is a kind of a hotbed of modernist activity. Our membership is generally pretty small. Usually between 4 and 7 people attend regularly in any given year. And it's a mixture of staff, postgraduate students, adjunct staff, and sometimes undergraduates, the very, very keen ones. Pilgrimage we read last year between March 2021 and March of this year, 2022. And this year we're reading Ulysses, and we aim to finish on Bloomsday, which is another interesting experiment. And we've actually opened up the group this year to members of the public, and we've got a few members of the public who are attending regularly and really seem to be enjoying it, which is kind of exciting. So that's a little bit about the group, and I'm going to now pass over to, who am I passing over to? Robbie? Fergus? Fergus, yes. Thanks, Fergus.
Fantastic. Okay, so thanks, Naomi. So rather than sharing my office background, I'm going to share my screen. The host has disabled it. Brad, are you able to let me do that? I'll explain why in a moment, because if I can share my screen here, then I will be able to share some maps. Here we go. Right. So fingers crossed, you can all see right now a big handwritten postcard, which is Dorothy Richardson's, along with a little title page. This is from the very fine Dorothy Richardson exhibition, which is online, and it's a postcard that she sent in 1937. But what it does, as far as I'm concerned, is it highlights two of the things I took from pilgrimage, which is firstly that Richardson's unexpectedly funny. Now, you might have to occasionally look for it, but the jokes are there. And secondly, that a lot of the novel for me, and a lot of what I was able to bring to a reading group, was the experience of someone who was born and lived in London, and who knows the streets that Richardson is living and walking around really quite well. So I'm going to spend a moment talking about both of those. But in case you're unable for some reason to make out Richardson's writing here on the left, she's talking to Briar about a woman who has just sent her 15 pages of extracts from the whole pilgrimage novel series in order to demonstrate that she's such a fan that she should be allowed to visit Richardson in London. So if any of you think that you're over the top with your Richardson obsessions, there are those who've gone further. And she goes on to, and I'm going to quote now, pass on a joke, pass on a yarn that last night reduced Alan and me to hysteria. Man at lunch party in conversation with damsel at his side, informs her his grandfather was killed at Waterloo, raps she, which platform? Cherishing the incident, he retails it later in the day to another lady. Idiot, she snorts, as if the platform mattered. So Richardson funny, and Richardson also deeply involved with London for much of the series. So we've already mentioned that I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania. Richardson and indeed modernism are a little bit outside my bailiwick, because I normally work with the plays of Tom Stoppard and Wittgenstein's philosophy of ethics. Back in the day, there's a philosophy degree that came before the English degrees. I moved to Australia in 2018, hence the lack of, the lack of an Australian accent, and started the PhD only, or just over a year ago now. So Richardson and the Modernist was almost my first contact with the reading group. Today, I'm going to talk very briefly about three things. Firstly, the experience of reading the book with a group. Secondly, a little bit longer, what I felt I was able to bring to the group a little bit, at least, which was some of the discussion of London. And finally, what I thought of as being at the end of the sequence, the major lacuna in the sequence, which, as you'll see there, I'm going to call trauma, though it can mean any number of separate incidents. In terms of the group, what does reading this sequence as a group bring? Well, for me, it brought three things. The first was accountability. We read fortnightly, roughly half a novel each time. And for a sequence that's this large, particularly by the time you get to towards the end of it, that really did matter. I mean, it mattered that other people had done the work. So for God's sake, turn up and know a little bit of what you're talking about, or at least have some of the questions to ask. And I think that was important. It wasn't important always to have understood everything, to have cribbed the notes, but to turn up and be willing to ask questions and engage, and at least express the second point here, some curiosity as to what was going on, to recognize that others had the same sorts of experiences, and that there may well be someone in the group who had got their head around a sentence or a phrase or a context or whatever else that might have passed me by as an individual, and indeed frequently did. Finally, I put sanity. There are points in the sequence where, for me, certainly, it just was not clear what was going on at all. Now, I'm not going to claim to have moved through all of those incidents, but some of them, I think it was quite important not to have got them the first time round, and to have needed the rereading and the re-rereading and the re-re-re-rereading in order to understand the point that Richardson was making, or not the point she was making as if it were an argument, but what she was trying to convey. It was useful, though, to know that others were in the same position, and the group really helped with that. So that was what I got out of the reading group, beyond just good conversation and something to do on a Tuesday afternoon. maybe what I could bring to the group, London in terms of distance and in terms of strata. So this is Edwardian London. The blue ribbon going through the middle is the Thames. The green blob on the left in the middle of the screen is Hyde Park. Above it, so sort of top left, that green blob is Regent's Park. And this map it's actually very late Victorian. What you're looking at there in terms of density is not too dissimilar from London today. So to give you some context, 1840, London has about 3 million people. But by 1890, so the earliest events of the sequence, London is 7 million people, and today it's around 8. So London has grown rapidly just before Richardson starts writing. And the London that was built over that period is largely the London that is still there today, notwithstanding the Blitz, amongst other things. And many of the locations that Richardson mentions and discusses are still there, and they're still there in more or less their present form. So the experience of reading the flaneur sections of the sequence is very different, or not very different, but is quite intimate if that is where you're from. To give some sense of scale of Richardson's London, this is a square mile. So the top left is Regent's Park. The bottom of that square is where Oxford Street meets Regent Street, all places mentioned in the novel and all well known by every tourist who visits London. This is Miriam and Dorothy's world. So I've picked out just 4 spots, but they're spots that I'm sure people will recognize. Right at the top, Finsbury Park, well, that's where the Perns School is. So that's the North London that, as Rebecca mentioned on the last of these sessions, was viewed as not really being London by Miriam. Down at the bottom, Cambridge Street, that's about as far as Miriam's walks go. There's an incident where she meets an old woman and sees a reflection of herself in the old woman, and it's quite a memorable incident in the novel. It's about as far as her walks go. Most of her time is spent between her apartment and the dental surgery. And I've used the addresses of the real places that Dorothy was based rather than second guessing fictionally where Miriam was. But when you read the novel, most of the locations that she is in are either within that red square or within a mile of either side, generally speaking to the right-hand side, slightly more towards the center of the map. It's not a big space. For reference, this is my London, again, 4 places. This time, let's begin right in the middle. Between Ensley Street and Harley Street is where I was born, University College Hospital. So I was born pretty much alongside Woburn Walk, which is where the events of the trap are set. At the top, Lambolly Road is on Primrose Hill. That's where I was taken as an infant from the hospital. The other 2 locations are the last place I lived in London, which was St Augustine's Mansions right at the bottom, and the British Library at the top. So every single day, as I was working on my master's in English, I would walk from St Augustine's down at the bottom to British Library at the top. And if you are a Londoner living in London, i.e. you're not someone who's taking the tube the whole time because you're a recent arrival or you're a tourist, you get to know those streets very well. And the result is that you realize on reading Pilgrimage, to bring this back to the novel sequence and back to Miriam's experiences, that while we get lots of visions of London and we get them from the street and they're new and they're novel and we haven't maybe seen them before in much British or English fiction, what we're not doing is we're not seeing the whole of the city and we're not seeing extensive distances covered. We're actually seeing a very small, very particular piece of London, largely remains as it is, and we're seeing it in some detail, and we're seeing it in some detail that we can put together if we know those streets. You don't need street map to be able to follow her as she walks and to know that she's not doing a lot more until she gets the bicycle other than walking around the block. I mean, maybe it's 2 or 3 blocks, but that's pretty much what she's doing. Again, just to give context, I'm a bit of a runner. On a Sunday, I'd go for a run. My long run on a Sunday would cover quite comfortably that circle, right? So Miriam's world for a contemporary Londoner really is very small and focused. I also thought, well, look, maybe Naomi or Robbie will say, well, he does too much running anyway, should be reading more books. nobody could humanly cover that distance. That's not a relevant reference point. So I went back and I remembered, well, who fictionally do you think of when you think of London? Well, I think at least every now and again of Oliver Twist. Oliver and Sykes walk from Bethnal Green to Chertsey in the course of a day, course of an afternoon, and that's the light blue line here. Now, Dickens is writing in 1840, so that's when London is just about to explode in terms of population growth, but still, the distance that is covered in Oliver Twist is multiples of what Richardson will cover. So I was able to discuss a little bit of that with the group, and that was context that might have helped. In terms of the strata, not just the distances, what that means is that if you're there and living in these streets, you realize that they are still the streets that Richardson knew. I'm going to give two examples. This is Woburn Walk, which is where the trap is set. And this row of houses at the top is pretty much as was in 1910, 12-ish, so just after Richardson left. She was in the set of apartments at the far right, bar one, over the road from Yeats, as we know from the novels. And as you can see from below, it looks pretty much the same today. The shops at the bottom are different, and you'll see that London, in an attempt to make itself tourist friendly, has kept in some of the what look like old gas lights, but it's very much her world. The second comparison is Harley Street. So Harley Street on the left, as you can see, 1910, 12-ish, and from Google Maps on the right, as close as I could get to the same view. Some of what looks from the modern view of Harley Street as if it might be new. So the little growth on the building at the right at the top, looks like it might be tacked on more recently by someone looking to develop the property. No, always there. So with the big windows, the only real difference is that they've cleaned the outside of the buildings. So Miriam's London, Dorothy's London, and our London, very compressed, but very recognizable, and it accumulates in layers. And that takes me to the final point I'll make, which is, having finished the sequence, I was reflecting on not what did I not enjoy, but what did I feel wasn't there, what was missing. And what was missing for me was, throughout this novel, which is displaying interiority on a relatively unreflective or live basis. I'm not going to use stream of consciousness. Pool of consciousness is fine. What's not there is, even in passing, references to what must have been enormous events, even in the fictional Miriam's life. There's never a rediscussion or a material going back to the events of the father and surrounding the loss of wealth and the shame on the family. There's never a go back to the mother's suicide in any form of either reflective or surprising, caught out of the corner of the eye sort of manner. And that will be, as one goes through the sequence, there are similar events, one involving a bicycle, one involving her relationship with Hypo, where that is a similar lacuna. And I don't think that's a flaw in the novel sequence. Clearly, it's an artistic choice that Richardson has made, but I do think it is reason to reflect on whether what we get is a truly unmitigated interior view of a person for the first time. So that's me gone on for far too long. Apologies. I hope that was almost useful. Back to Naomi. Or indeed, sorry, Naomi, on to Robbie.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk now. Thanks so much, Fergus. And thanks for inviting us. It's delightful to be talking about Dorothy Richardson again. It was a very idiosyncratic project that we embarked on, and then all of a sudden another group started doing it, and we didn't feel quite so alone. I suppose where I am coming from when reading this book is the opposite of Fergus. I did live in the UK for a little bit, but never got my head around London. So I very much feel like I'm reading Pilgrimage from afar, from a distance. We are in Tasmania and definitely feel our lack of proximity to the centres of modernism and the kinds of texts that for instance, me and Naomi study are not Tasmanian texts. So we are coming at this from an interesting angle, I think, and I'm interested in if there are other members of the group who are not based in England, how they felt about reading the book at a distance. The themes that leapt out at me as a Tasmanian reader of this sequence were clearly Dorothy Richardson's, international theme, if you like, her interest in Englishness as seen through the eyes of others, her interest in other cultures, her interest in travel, as well as her constant movement through space through the entire sequence. This is a wonderful epic of boarding houses and lodging houses. And I believe you've just finished book 4, where we're starting to get some wonderful descriptions of London boarding houses in this part of the sequence, and that was always fun for me. I'm a scholar who has written, I just read a book on hotels and modernist culture, so I'm very interested in temporary lodgings of all kinds. What caught my eye first when we began the sequence in Pointed Roofs was the Australian character who is in that book, Gertrude Goldring, and I was just going through descriptions of that figure and reminded of how much I was drawn to that figure at the beginning. She's described as a dark-skinned, athletic-looking Australian. We hear about the horse-hacking laugh of the Australian. Richardson talks about how the dreadful outline of her shoulders was visible, the squarish oval of her face shone out, the wide forehead from which the wiry black hair was combed to a high puff, the red eyes black now, the long straight nose, the wide laughing mouth with the enormous teeth, which fits in with her future interest in dentistry, I suppose. We hear that Gertrude sings like a London dustman, and that she fixes her hair, which is described as a fuzzy cloud, with a dagger-like tortoiseshell ornament like a Maori. So these are really fascinating representations of an Australian abroad, and they fit in with broader patterns of representation that we're seeing at this time in the turn of the 20th century, in the early decades of the 20th century. This idea that colonials are sort of exports from the motherland, who have baked a little bit in the Antipodean sun, who have kept with them this kind of physicality, the pioneering spirit that has been maybe drained from an exhausted English culture, that the Australian is more natural and more alive. At the same time, figures like this in culture of the time were also regarded with a bit of suspicion, because it was felt that the sort of white exports of the white settler culture had somehow also been tainted by being colonial. And we get this interesting sort of flirtation in these descriptions with Gertrude's so-called darkness and her wiry hair, as if she's been slightly indigenized by becoming a colonial figure. So at once we get this kind of fetishization of colonial figures in British literature of the time. When you get to interim, when you start talking about interim, we also have these Canadians who come into the picture. And it's mentioned that Canadian men have kept something that English men are losing. Again, feeding into that trope of the colonial sort of fostering something that is lost in the mother country. What's particularly interesting about Dorothy Richardson is, though, that she's not coming at this from a fixed perspective, that her own sense of her Englishness is sort of viewed at a distance as well. She's someone who has a very complicated relationship with her own culture, and who is, when she's talking about this Australian, is herself trying to adapt to another culture in Germany. She herself is a bit of a fish out of water. And then we see when she moves into London in the following books of the sequence, that she sort of lives on the, if you like, edges of London, both geographically, but also because she is quite poor at this time. And she's always living in temporary or provisional accommodations of one form or another. We see, as I mentioned, a lot of lodging houses and boarding houses in the book. The difference simply being, but an important difference being, that lodging houses you can more or less keep to yourself in your own room and keep others who live in the space at a bit of a distance. In boarding houses, that's more difficult because you all eat together and therefore you all share these social spaces. You're all living with each other in a much more direct way, and it feels more like living in a bourgeois home where everyone has to come together in these public spaces and make conversation. So in both lodging houses and boarding houses, there are all kinds of fascinating experiences that I won't spoil, if you like. If this is a novel sequence that we can spoil through plot details, I'm not sure that's possible. But I think what's really interesting about her experience in these spaces is that she thinks a lot about architecture. She thinks a lot about space and about the atmospheres of spaces. We get some wonderful descriptions of rooms which seem to change character even as she moves through them. Spaces are these home-like, provisional home-like spaces in London are interesting because they are at once a source of privacy for her and security for a woman who is embarking on a more independent style of life, who's gone out to work, who's left the family home. These are spaces that provide, if you like, the cliche, a room of one's own. That by escaping the bourgeois home where women were so often needed to be on display, needed to be in the sort of semi-publicity of the drawing room, now she can be blissfully private and do her own thing in many of these spaces until she gets to sort of negotiating those difficult boarding house politics. So that we get that sense of privacy, but we also get that sense that these spaces are connected to the city in a broader way, that when she's inside, she's also outside. There is a lot of descriptions throughout the sequence of rooms that are connected to the outside world. There's a lot of scenes where she looks out of windows, where she's listening to what's going on outside. We get the noises, the smells, the warmth of the city coming in, the atmosphere of the city. So a lot of the time she's sort of inside and outside at the same time, thinking about the possibilities of this large city while also contained in these little tiny lodging spaces. So yeah, I might actually leave it there. Those are the kinds of things that I was drawn to, I suppose, when I was reading this book, these books from a distance. Naomi, do you want to pick up?
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Robbie. So I am going to talk about something, again, a little bit different to what Fergus and Robbie have spoken about. So my background, I am a senior lecturer in English here. I'm interested in modernism and in what Robbie and I kind of jokingly call the modernist adjacent. And we came up with this kind of joking term to talk about our discomfort with with how we felt we related to modernist studies generally. So my most enduring research area is with the works of Evelyn Waugh. I'm currently editing Waugh's 1932 novel Black Mischief as part of the complete works of Evelyn Waugh. I don't think that Waugh read Richardson. He did know about and read other modernists sometimes, like Woolf, Huxley, Joyce, Eliot, and Mansfield. He was variously disparaging about many of them, although he liked Eliot to begin with, and he liked the early Huxley. And I think he liked Orlando as well. But the point of comparison or relation for me, the kind of interesting thing that I hooked into when we were reading these novels, or this novel, was its experiment with time, and also the fact that these two historical people, Waugh and Richardson, overlapped in time and place. Waugh also, at various points in his life, lived in London. They were writing roughly at a similar time, although Waugh is significantly younger than Richardson. And I was really curious about the experiment of writing a continuous narrative across such long stretches of books. So that was the thing that I kept on coming back to, that kind of experiment with temporality. It really was an incredible experiment in narrative duration and a test of readerly attention, I think. I don't want to kind of give the false impression that this wasn't an enjoyable test. It's that kind of like stretch and challenge that seems a little bit athletic when you're reading books, a book like this. To keep in your head all the different characters as they come in and out of Miriam's life, to remember events, especially given Richardson's habit of not narrating them, or only narrating them kind of to the side of what Miriam is thinking in the moment. This is a big challenge, and it's a kind of an interesting challenge to think about what it is that is interesting in a novel to the novelist. We as a reading group experience the duration of reading differently to Richardson's original readers, of course. We read these books over the course of a year, but Richardson's original audience would have experienced these books over the course of 50 years, and many readers, I imagine, would not have made it to the last novel, just by accident of time. So, those original readers would have had their memories of minor characters, their recall of events, or their kind of the test of plugging the gaps between different novels tested even further. And I do sometimes wonder whether that test of basic recall might have had something to do with the kind of lukewarm reception by critics, particularly with the later novels. So to me, this experiment in narrative time was incredibly intriguing. Richardson focuses within the individual volumes on quite narrow time periods, but between them inserts these large gaps often. And a lot of our discussion, as Fergus has suggested, centered on working out what was happening in those gaps, how much time had elapsed, but also why Richardson chose to focus on particular things at length. Why we would get a long sequence of pages focusing on a kind of reasonably mundane conversation walking down the street, or why we might get the kind of complete substance of a lecture, and not focus on others like sex or or death, which one might assume would be more dramatic, more kind of novelistic. And this kind of resistance to the kind of conventional definition of drama or action, I found intriguing, sometimes frustrating. There were kind of often, I would start off on a low point and get very enthusiastic through the conversation. But that's the thing that I kind of came back to again and again. And that Richardson was kind of committed to this method of writing is really proven by the exception to the rule that we have chatted about a little bit already today, which is Oberland, volume 9, in which Miriam goes on an action-packed holiday. And I hope that's not too much of a spoiler, but it is a real treat. And in part, it's such an interesting volume in the sequence because so much happens, and it's also a departure in terms of space. She's not in London, and she's doing lots of stuff. It's kind of fun. So one of the things that I think is interesting in relation to this experiment in time is the way that Richardson's method is really focusing again on Miriam's experience in the present, and how she's communicating that experience through imagery, language, and point of view. We talked a lot about the kind of narrative methods that she used, the kind of repetition of particular keywords, her interest in shape or shapelessness, keywords like radiance. We talked a lot about what radiance was. This is described in the trap as light falling upon the shapes of things, reflected back, moving through the day, a steadfast friend, silent and understanding. None of the events, none of the passions of life better than this sense of light quietly falling. And I kind of feel like this is a kind of a lovely encapsulation of the concerns that I at least felt Richardson had with writing novels, which was, not that the kind of this exciting event happened next, but it's the what is it that catches the attention of the individual consciousness in the moment. So for me, the things that I engaged with the most were those moments of the consciousness that is captured, which are carried over in these incredibly sharp descriptions of particular things. So I loved the descriptions of clothes and hair. Robbie's read out to you one description of hair already. I found this incredibly endearing. I think Richardson's great on clothes, and it's something that I think that gets dismissed quite easily, but I found the kind of details of that kind of late Victorian, early Edwardian style of dress really, really fascinating. And I also have a little slide of quotes that I want to pull up, if that's okay. I'll see if I can share my screen. I don't know if I can. A minute. That's not what I want to do. Okay. So these kind of, I guess, almost impressionistic or imagistic moments in the novel that to me were connected with my reading of other modernist texts. So I'll come back to dental drudgery because I also related deeply to this. I was a dental nurse for a while before I became an academic. Okay, so firstly, I just want to talk about cigarettes. So this was really one of my kind of early and favorite descriptions. And it's, of course, it's a much longer passage in in back order, and the whole of the passage where Miriam's rolling the cigarettes, and then kind of for her father, and yeah, she's rolling them for her father, right? And she's thinking about whether or not, you know, about rolling the cigarettes, and then she thinks, well, why shouldn't I smoke a cigarette? And this kind of, you know, quite beautiful little kind of idea pops into her head, and she thinks about, well, you know, what is there to stop me? And then she smokes this cigarette. And again, this is a kind of a moment of connection for me as a person rather than as an academic, because I used to be a smoker, and I honestly have never read a better description of cigarette smoking. It's such a good advertisement of the pleasure and the sensory pleasure of smoking. The kind of hedonistic aspects of it, but also the kind of the connection. I guess it's a slowing of time that the cigarette allows, because as you're focusing solely on the smoke, I guess. I just think this description is such a beautiful kind of moment, and it's such a small moment to spend such a long, you know, relatively period of time on in the narrative. Another moment that I loved, and it's a kind of a hedonistic moment, but her writing about beer as well. I thought this was, again, this kind of absolute perfection of sensory description. So this drinking the beer for the first time, and this is in the pages previous. She's with Michael Shattoff. She's at this restaurant, and she doesn't like the beer initially, and he says to her, well, you can't drink it in little sips, you've got to take a big long drink. And so she does. It was still bitter, but the bitterness was only an astringent tang in the strange, cool, lively, frothy tide. A tingling warmth ran through her nerves, expanding to a golden glow that flowed through the room and held her alight within itself, an elastic, impalpable, bodiless mind. And I just love this. I just think it's such a fantastic description of what it is that captures our kind of sensory, our sensory mind. And that's the kind of, those were the points where I really connected with this character, and with what it was that the novel was doing in relation to the kind of the capturing of the momentary versus the kind of attenuation of I guess what we might more conventionally think of as a narrative through line. Finally, I just want to talk about dentistry. I don't have anything historical to bring to this, but what I do have is a kind of deep connection with this representation of work, and I think this is you know, reasonably revolutionary, I suppose, in the representation of work, and especially in the representation of women workers, but just the kind of I guess commitment to the and then of work. This was kind of, yeah, again, exhilarating in its attention to the mundane. As I said, I used to be a dental nurse before I became an academic. It was my job during university, and there are a lot of things here which I could identify with. The cleaning, the kind of the rush which is at the same time extremely kind of boring, but pressing, and the kind of incredible repetition of these activities day after day. So to me, the tunnel was a kind of a high point, in the sense that even though what happens in it is not very fun for Miriam, it was just incredibly realistic, I suppose, in what it was trying to do to explain what work was to a readership who probably hadn't really seen this kind of I guess, semi-skilled work before. So do I have anything else to say? I don't know. I'll stop sharing my screen. There are a lot of these kinds of like strange moments throughout the novel that I thought were that I loved. There's a alabaster lady's forefinger in the trap, which we talked about at length, which is a detail that you, I guess, will come to enjoy. The description of the downhill sledging in Oberland, again, absolutely delightful. So those were the things that I really wanted to talk about, that contrast between the kind of miniature at the level of the moment and the kind of very, very long stretch of scale in the narrative time. And that's all I have.
Okay, well, thank you to all three, Naomi, Robbie, and Fergus. Wonderful thoughts and perspectives on that. I want to open this up for everybody, and if you have a question, either raise your hand or speak up in the chat. I just wanted to get the discussion started by putting before, and any or all of you can address it. As our group, we're almost at the halfway point in terms of numbers of pages. What makes it worth sticking through to the end?
I mean, there's a deep sense of pride, I suppose. I mean, I didn't talk about the later books very much, but Dimple Hill is there's beautiful the kind of focus shifts, but there's beautiful work on nature, on gardens in Dimple Hill, which is really, again, and I suppose again the focus is shifting from into maybe a more interior kind of grappling with faith in those books. But there's still a lot to delight in them. That I think as she moves out of London, they get less depressing.
But yeah, I mean, I think maybe that's one of the key points. What it's not is it's not more of the same, right? So you're not going to keep reading the same incident in the dental surgery for another 5 novels. And I think Naomi's absolutely right. Possibly one of the bits that I found least engaging, but it's a material shift and it's clearly important, is that move to a discussion of faith. And you just haven't reached that, I don't think, in the first half. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes kind of what you see is we're in the period where she's dealing with a lot of fairly practical life issues, establishing her identity, which to me, just the whole shaping of one identity, particularly because to me, one of the great things about Miriam as a character is she's not picking off the set menu of the roles that society is offering her. She's often, especially in the first 3 books, she's like holding up these examples and saying, that doesn't work for me. And then by the end, she really is, as you say, she's trying to really discover what her fundamental purpose is and explore that. And so it does get, it does become a much different book as it goes on. I just can say for myself, knowing the history of how the books came out and what Richardson was dealing with, the first time I read it through, I was almost feeling like I was cheering on a marathon runner, stick with it. There's only a couple more miles to go. You can do it.
Yeah, something that's been happening in the chat is this the point that is made that you stick with it because of Miriam, and I think this is a really great point. That that it's impossible to not be endeared to somebody over such a long stretch of I guess you have, it's a relationship that you're kind of building with this character. And in the first, I think, she is such an interesting person. She's such a frustrating person in so many ways, but you still want to see how she's going to react. I suppose because of that point that you made, that she doesn't react in the ways that you expect, even of a fictional character. She's a surprising person. That's it's engrossing.
Yeah, it's nice to see other people are picking up on that as well. You become accustomed to essentially how demanding, at least I feel like Richardson expects us to game up in terms of encountering the text and encountering the world. And that kind of becomes addictive. So is there anybody out there who wants to ask a question? I've noticed we've had several comments about specific Australia connections. And I apologize as I'm not catching. I see Karen, if you would like to.
Yeah, I would ask Fergus a question about North London, because I mean, I understand a little bit about what she might be referring to in terms of North London, but I thought since we have an expert here, I might get this as skinny as in terms of what you really felt like her perceptions, or how do other Londoners perceive North London, and what are the things that she's really objecting to in those passages?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, I can give my very modern impressions of that. Clearly, it will have changed over time. The one note of historic context I'd give is back in 1890, you're starting to see the train lines built into London, and those train lines will become major terminuses on the outer ring. And within that inner ring, you're going to get the tube system, so the subway system in a US context that links things together today. The way that London is still full of incredible bias on a suburb by suburb, street by street basis. So I listened to Rebecca speaking on actually the last pilgrimage note here that was last pilgrimage discussion, and saying, making absolutely correct comments about how, well, we might think of Highgate as being London. Why on earth doesn't, why wouldn't Miriam? If you're in the middle of London, you would say, well, Highgate, that's not real London. It's not proper London. The major divides are north and south of the river, right? So south of the river, a North Londoner thinks that is a plague pit. It's clearly, Shakespeare's Globe was over there for good reason, because that's where the Bishop of Southwark kept all the brothels, etc., and that still plays through today. What is layered on top of that for a modern Londoner, if you're male, typically, is going to be football, soccer rivalries. So you've got so many soccer teams that exist at a very local level within London, and some of them have supporter groups that break down on either ethnic or in some cases racial lines. But even if you're not involved in that sort of more vicious form of localism, tube station by tube station, I would say that my local tube was Pimlico. Well, I'm Pimlico, I'm in Westminster. If you're as far away as Bloomsbury, I mean, well, look at you over in Bloomsbury with your big high rooms and your pretensions to being Virginia Woolf, So the sense that Richardson gives of London actually being an incredibly insular, narrow space is still very much felt. You might have slightly different borders, but what you'll have if you're there the whole time now is you'll have the combination of two things that I think I tried to bring out. Firstly, radical distinctions between across very small distances, but at the same time, the capacity to move across all those distances by foot in the course of an afternoon. The nearest US equivalent I can think of, and I've lived in different cities in the States before, it's not like a major city like Detroit or Chicago. it's far more like an extended Manhattan as it is now, right? So you know that if you're talking about 63rd on the upper West Side, well, you already know I'm talking about the Lincoln Center and the sort of people that want to go to the opera. And if you're based down in, 32nd, or if you're up on 110th and you're by the university, you already know where I'm talking about, and you've started to form an idea of who it is that lives there. London is exactly the same as that. It's just slightly larger than Manhattan is, if that's useful. But the points that Miriam's picking up on, it's a London that is recognized by a modern Londoner. Dickens' London isn't. Dickens' London is a mythical place where it always snows at Christmas, and there are horses, and different world of only 3.5 million. It's an overgrown, or it's a rapidly industrializing town that still isn't quite clear that it's not Shakespeare's London anymore. Miriam's London, Dorothy's London is today's London, only, slightly archaic, or at least that's the way it feels on reading it.
Great, thank you so much.
I see that Phyllis has a question.
Here we go. I am now unmuted. Is that correct?
Yep.
Good. Thank you so much, all of you. I just quickly, Fergus, I totally agree with the humor in Richardson. Right now in interim, she's making those language jokes with disease, D-I-Z-Z-I-Z-Z, and knowledge and Beatrice, and I love that postcard. And Robbie, as an American, I appreciate her mixed feelings about her colonial cousins. But Naomi, your narrative experiment is really hitting parts of what is meaning so much to me to be reading this. I picked up the original books from the Cal Library. I'm here in Berkeley, the first editions, and so far every one at the end, the publisher has listed the names of the titles that have already been printed, and then would say in preparation. And I almost feel as if, just as we now able to read them all in one 12-month period, but even her readers having to go over half a century, what we're going through to keep up with this narrative, I feel as if she had to too. I mean, she was 40 something when she started this, so she had to go back and find herself. And then I would love to know how far ahead she thought, and if it was all right there, or if she had to, it's almost like she had to do her own, what we have to go through to read her book, she was going through too, is what I'm trying to say. And finally, I'm really struck by how often she talks about writing. And she has one description here in interim where she talks about, she says, why did men write books, modern men? Fabric, how do you find his words? It made the page alive, a woven carpet. On one side, a beautiful glowing pattern, on the other, dull, stringy harshness. I would argue that she's saying dull, stringy harshness is not a bad thing to be doing, especially if you're not a modern man writer. But anyway, this has been really helpful. And the London information is really good too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Phyllis. It's an excellent point there. I've noticed a couple of questions about particularly areas of London, the bus routes and things like that. I would highly recommend, and you can find it on the Open Library. You can find used copies, but you have to search and they're not necessarily good. But the Baedeker Guide, Baedeker was a German travel guide company that started publishing in the late 19th century these little red books, which are wonderful travel guides. And they were, really a fundamental for most travelers of the Edwardian period. But the Baedeker Guide for London of around the 1900s-ish time frame actually has quite a lot of detailed information about transportation, among other things. And so you can see, for example, the journey that happens in Backwater as Miriam and her mother leave the Pern sisters school and travel into Piccadilly Circus and then change and take another bus to go out to their house, that there were different companies. Those were different companies that essentially in Finsbury Park, you would walk to the terminus of a particular bus company. And that's why that bus ride can be traced so precisely in Backwaters, because particularly by the Baedeker guide of that time.
Can I just say on Phyllis's point that that she was making earlier, that not only is it a book that is a big exercise in memory and in reproducing her life on the page, but it's also thinking a lot about how do you capture a life on the page. It's thinking about, you know, what is the most honest way of writing a life. And that's why Naomi, when she was mentioning the kind of keywords, the sort of verbal tics that kept coming up, that you started to notice a lot as you're going through the books, and one of them was this word shape. And for me, shape kept jumping out because she was thinking about shape versus shapelessness, form versus formlessness. You know, is it dishonest to bound one's life in a formal way? Is it, or is formlessness a more realistic way of getting to the experience of daily life? There's so many really interesting passages that are thinking about those questions, which which I really found fascinating, and that is a sort of line that travels through the sequence for sure.
Well, it strikes me that this touches on the point that Fergus made about trauma and how, and we've talked about it several times in the course of these Zoom discussions, that Richardson, you know, the key traumas of her life are touched on so glancingly. I kind of wonder that if that wasn't in a way, I mean, number one, it may be that psychologically she didn't feel prepared to actually confront them head on, but it also may be representation in terms of realism, because, you know, we all have traumas in our life, and then, you know, 3 days later, we've got to go to the grocery store, and we've got to, you know, we have errands to run, and we're sitting in traffic, or, you know, we're dealing with email, or you know, and it's not there in front of us. It's not hanging there, permeating every single moment. At least, you know, you know, because otherwise we have psychological breakdown, or you know, we become blocked.
So I think, Brad, just to pick up on that, I think I would maybe, to add some nuance to the point I already made. I think that's absolutely right. But I do think it's interesting in such an extended sequence that, just as you say, we don't choose to draw on our traumas every day. There are occasions in our lives where, out of the corner of our eye, we will see something that will bring back a memory or an incident, whether we like it or not. And so I suppose my point is not that there isn't an extended discussion of any of these events. And as I say, I completely appreciate this is an artistic choice being made by Richardson. This is not biography, and it doesn't pretend to be, right? It says it's fiction. But if you're going to represent interiority faithfully, to me, that corner of the eye of something that is a reminder of one of these events at some point is the piece that to me felt like it wasn't there. And maybe to shift the subject very slightly in a different direction, one of the other joys of the novel that I think we did pick up reading it as a group, and I think reading it as a group helps, is the phonetic speech that pops up every now and again, which can be very funny, but really does need a bit of an audience every now and again to really bring it out.
That's a great point. Yeah. Although I think, thank God she didn't, you know, she was writing these at a time when there was this real wave of dialect novels, both, in America, we saw it with like the Joel Chandler Harris Brer Rabbit books, but there were tons of them in the UK with Yorkshire and Cockney accents, and they're just unreadable. Page after page of that is just agonizing. I give her a lot of credit for being choosy in how she uses that.
Very true, very true.
Are there other questions out there in the group? We want to take advantage of these folks while we've got them. I'm seeing lots of questions about transportation issues. Yes, thank you for Naomi about the comment about smoking. I was only a smoker for the briefest of times, but this is interesting, and I would just say that there's a whole fascinating. I'm sure somebody's written a book about it, but the whole linkage of smoking as an example of women's freedom is both something that's kind of dramatic in terms of its connection, particularly with the suffragette movement and the general, new woman movement. But what's also a little bit sinister is if you follow that, by the early 20s, a guy named Edward Bernays, on behalf of the tobacco industry, exploits that to build the image of women smoking with the flappers as a way to sell cigarettes, to push cigarettes consumption out there. So, once again, capitalism strikes and exploits symbols to its own advantages. Let's see. Questions about social class. One note that I would make, what's kind of interesting about this book, unlike a lot of other works of English literature, particularly of the 19th century, but well into the 20th, even law is a perfect example of that, is that Miriam and Richardson almost never deals with the highest and the lowest. I mean, she's really there in the middle class. The upper middle class, the family that she governesses for, but she never. I mean, there's no nobility in this book, I don't think. And likewise,
Yeah.
she never really gets. Once actually in the tunnel, she has a little bit where she thinks about women working, drudgery jobs. And I think that comes back from time to time, but she doesn't really get to know working class people.
Yeah, it seems like there's this kind of quite particular class, and it really is like the differences in class in what we might see as differences in class are in lots of cases differences really in wealth, that Richardson and the people who Miriam and the people who she's associating with, in Bloomsbury aren't necessarily lower class. They're just they're poor, but they they're educated. They're middle class people. So it kind of seems like, it's not like reading a war novel where you're trying to work out what the kind of differences in rank are between an earl and a baron, which are quite simple to determine actually, but the earl's more important. It's really that kind of question of wealth, but also the question of to what extent have you maintained your social conventionality versus a kind of rejection of the conventional middle class experience. And which I feel also connects to the geography of the novel as well. The kind of choice to live in Bloomsbury rather than somewhere else.
I think there are also constant reminders of her precariousness. as well.
Yeah.
She, when she goes to her ABC cafes and orders an egg, she orders very Spartan food. She's out in public, and that's extremely pleasurable, and she's reading in these cafes, but but her expenses are very basic. She thinks a lot about the clothes that she can't afford, and the styles, the way that she would like to style herself if she had money. In Oberland, many volumes to come, she gets the cheapest hotel room that she can. There's constant reminders that that she's limited in various ways, and she is also reliant on other people. There are times when she is a guest in other people's homes, so there is this sort of rush of this sense of freedom and possibility in London, but money is always a limit to that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
There's that combination of her precarity with people she's close to who do not have that precarity in their lives, but also don't want to really acknowledge it in hers. The obvious example being Hypo, but equally with Shatov and others who we're led to understand are extremely moneyed. Well, there's issues of access because of gender, there's issues of access because of class, and these fine distinctions. But when it comes to money, it's not only something not talked about, it's something that very rarely people want to acknowledge through their actions with Miriam. And I guess that does change a little bit when you come to the later novels. Once she's in the countryside, particularly in the environment that she's in, there's less of a concern over the minute-to-minute expenses that there certainly is in the city, as Robbie absolutely rightly says.
Yeah, it's a good point. Somebody, I see Jennifer was making a comment about parallels with Barbara Pym. Barbara Pym actually was fairly good about writing about her literary influences. So it might be worth looking at her diaries, or a selection of her diaries have been published. And then recently a biography. It might be worth checking in there to see if she did in fact read and was influenced by Richardson. I know that she was very influenced by a book by a writer that I've been studying named Gertrude Trevelyan, an Oxford novel that she wrote. So I know Pym was fairly clear about her influences in that way. Any other comments or questions that folks would like to raise while we've got this wonderful collection of minds together? If not, I will turn it back to Fergus and Robbie and Naomi if they want to offer any closing thoughts and encouragement for the group here today to spur them on to stick with our journey with Miriam.
Well, look, for the sake of logistics, I'll get in first. Robbie, you're up next if you've got anything to say, and I'll leave Naomi for the final sign off. I think from my perspective, is it worth making it through to the end of 13 novels? If you are on this Zoom call, yes. Good grief, don't leave it unfinished. And I think the point about strata, Richardson's building up layers of a life over time, and it's not complete because no life is until the last second of its living, but each layer has its own importance and its own relationship to all those that have gone before and will come after, and that in itself is worth carrying on with. Robbie.
Yes, thank you. I would say that you're about to go into the sort of central novels in the sequence that are quite abstract, and there are a couple of novels that are very much inside Miriam's head, but they aren't all like that. I mean, those ones are interesting in their own way, but they are a little bit more harder going, I think, those central novels. But I think it's always fascinating that Richardson is still experimenting in each of those books, that they're all thinking about daily life and representing events in slightly different ways. And it's always a pleasure to open up the next book and to say, something feels slightly different here. You can feel the years that have passed when you start reading the next novel in the sequence.
So something that I didn't talk about, but that I think is really important is closure. So many of the volumes don't have that sense of a kind of a conventional closure, narrative closure, and March Moonlight does not have that sense of conventional closure either. So it is, again, it's a kind of it's an interesting experience which I have relished and which I would just say you should stick with, because even if it doesn't comfort in the same way that a tightly plotted novel with a conventional ending might do, it's doing something different and really special, which is, I think, really important. And I hope it's not, I don't know whether this is too much of a spoiler to use, but the last word of can I tell them the last word of the sequence? It's such a good last word. I'll just say it's like the perfect last word.
Give everyone, here you go. Here's your 5-second warning. Right? Plug your ears or turn off if you don't want to know the last word of the novels.
Absolutely,
which is
yes.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Reveal.
Fulfillment.
Wonderful. Yes.
Such a good last word. And yeah, like that's I think that's the feeling that you get at the end. It's not closure, but it is fulfillment.
Wonderful. That's a great way to wrap up this discussion, and hopefully inspired everybody. I mean, I think this is such a fabulous book, and going through it a second time with this group has just been, or with a group as opposed to by myself, has simply reinforced it. So I thank you all. I know it's been an early morning for you, but wonderful thoughts and inputs. I think everybody enjoyed taking part of it, and we just hope that we can keep spreading the word about what a terrific novel it is. I have said this, and people who've been on other conferences have heard me say this, so I'm beating a dead horse, but it just staggers me that Proust is in every bookstop, with any decent collection, and you can't find Pilgrimage. I mean, you have, even if you want to read it, you have to go hunt for it. And of the two books, obviously Proust is an amazing masterpiece, but there's so much that relates to life as we experience it today that's worth discovering in Pilgrimage. So thank you all for sharing your own experiences and thoughts about it. It's been wonderful. And for our friends in Tasmania, farewell and have a great day.
Thanks, Brad.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for having us.
Bye-bye.